Today, I'd just like to talk to you guys about the immigration levels plan that was released on November 5th, a day after the budget, with most of the numbers actually in the budget as well. I kind of want to go through it line by line and just explain what it means, what's different compared to previous year's budget, how I think this is going to then reflect in the next year's immigration draws, objectives, and those sorts of things. So, what to watch out for. It's important for applicants, but I'm also going to use this as an opportunity to also show some inconsistencies and some what I would consider misrepresentative behavior by the federal government, putting some data in the immigration levels plan in the budget and then sugarcoating it. Let's get straight to it. A perfect example that, quite frankly, I have an issue with in both the budget and in the immigration levels plan. They talk about these one-time measures to recognize with the British spelling eligible protected persons in Canada. They tell you how much it's going to cost, but they don't tell you how many people that's going to impact. They also mention that they're going to have a one-time measure for workers, also known as economic class immigrants. And they do mention the number 33,000 work permit holders, which, when looking at the overall projected emissions ranges, you can see that's reasonable. It's a 7 to 8% difference. And we don't know what the number is for protected persons, but when you look at the immigration levels plan, and it's significantly higher, both proportionally to the workers, the economic class migrants, a 380% increase when it's 115,000, which is actually, that's a lot. 115,000 protected people over 2 years, or persons in need of protection, is a significant amount. Okay. And these are people that have applied and they're within Canada and they've applied for refugee protection, essentially. The number of protected persons is targeted at 20,000 per year. This special measure, this interim measure, is going to increase that 57,500 for a total of 77,500 over the next 2 years each year, which is a substantial amount of people. It's over 15,000 more than targets. They do mention here that it is not included. These admissions are in addition to those identified in the above permanent resident admission targets. And you don't see it there, but it would be here. So just add another 57,500 and then another 16,500 students there. And you're going to get a number that's much more reminiscent of Trudeau's, crazy immigration times. So I can see why they didn't include that. It's an obscene amount. It basically is 6 years of quota. You could say 8 years of quota over a period of 2 years. That's a lot. They should at least kind of amortize those 20,000 targets over those 115,000 over the next 4, 5, 6 years. I think that would be better. And if those are genuinely people in need of protection, then just kind of extend that time. And obviously don't accept any more claims or try to reduce the amount of claims that are coming in or invalidate the ones that are coming in, because it's a big burden on the system. Protected persons get access to the federal health insurance program, which Canadians and PRs don't get. That's extended health care. That's vision coverage. What strikes me is, there's a little bit of a reduction and a bit of a distinction between what they call federal high skilled now and previously before, which was economic priorities and Canada focus and whatnot. But if you add these two up, it's pretty close. They're going a little bit less on express entry, because that is express entry right there. Federal business, that startup visa went from 1,500 to 6,000 in crazy Trudeau times, down to 500 now a year, which is exactly why there's something like 42,000 startup visa applications in process. Check out the minister's transition binder. So that's an 84-year backlog. They're definitely going to do something about all those applications in process. I mean, they have to. For the federal economic pilots, I think these are great for They would be great for wanting to meet the Francophone targets. So you'll notice here that they talk about overall French-speaking permanent resident admissions outside Quebec. You probably feel like every express entry draw, or at least every other one at this point, is a Francophone draw. And part of that is true because this 9% is the overall permanent resident admission. So they're basically applying this percentage. And you're probably wondering, well, why is that? Well, they can't select French family-based targets. You don't have language requirements when you want to sponsor your spouse. It doesn't matter what language they speak. What matters is the bona fides of the relationship. Same thing with refugees and protected persons. If you've got a reason to flee and not be able to return home, it doesn't matter if you speak French or English. Same thing with the humanitarian and compassionate. It's a very small stream anyways. You can see it takes up less than 1.5% of admissions. What I would want to focus on if I was seeking to get permanent residence in Canada, I would say that express entry, at least over the next couple of years, is going to be exceptionally challenging if you're not one of three people. One, if you don't have the prospects of getting to a CLB7 intermediate level of French proficiency, you will struggle to transition to permanent residence because 1/3 of the invitations are going there. We can see that something like when we look at the express entry history, show you that you're going to see that a vast majority of them are overseas, something like 81 or 84%. So yes, if you can learn to a CLB7 French or get to that proficiency, then yes, you're going to be maybe 1/3 of these express entry admissions. The other, maybe 1/3 and a little bit more, maybe more like 40%, are going to be these category-based selections, which you're wondering, when are they going to change the categories? They have STEM as a category, but they did not do STEM this year. They have trades, but they have line cooks in trades, but they don't have chefs. Okay, my recommendation would be exactly what I've done is if you go to COPS data, I was curious as to why line cooks were involved in the trade draw, but chefs were not. Because I know a girl, she's a chef and she's salaried. She makes a really good amount annually. And yeah, she doesn't qualify because she's not a line cook, which I think is kind of sad because what it means is we're prioritizing somebody who makes $17 an hour at A&W versus someone who makes 70 grand a year as a sous chef. You can look at probably assessment of recent labor market or projected. And one of the most important things you can do as an aspirant wanting to get to PR in Canada, it always seems like they're shifting the goalposts, especially recently. And I think they have to because the demand to come to Canada is very high and they struggle to create a purely merit-based process that requires a lot of work. So what's easier for them is to just let people time out, not hold draws, randomly throw in other categories, and kind of use that as a way to thin the herd. I believe that's what they do, even though they may not publicly say that they do. We can look at STEM. I was wondering, why did we lose all of our software, all of our basically our tech occupations in here? And now they're talking about wanting to bring H-1Bs from the United States. And that's got me thinking, what's the point if they're not going to have a permanent path to stay? So this is exactly why. And I wonder why insurance agents and brokers was put in there. Because when you go to, if you look at the knock.esdc.ca, like if I check out just the hierarchy and structure, this is how they classify jobs in Canada in the Canadian immigration context. And these are known as the occupational groups, if I'm not mistaken. Everything else in STEM is literally, it starts with 2, and then we've got insurance agents and brokers, which starts with 6, which is the sales and service occupation. It's Second digit is a 3, which, by the way, means tier 3. So here it is. If you go to 6.3, now it's going to be searching by NOx. There's a moderate risk of shortage for insurance agents and brokers. This is my argument and other leading economists in Canada, although I'm not a leading economist, but there are leading economists that do state that one of the issues with the current category-based system is you're focused on short-term labor considerations. This is why they have cooks in here, moderate risk of shortage. But for some reason, bakers, unfortunately, they're balanced, but bakers are very similar to cooks. In fact, bakers are actually more specialized than cooks, in my view. And if you go to 6.2, which is where you're going to find your chefs, this will explain why chef isn't there, because it's in balance. If I go to what are our software engineers, 2.1, database analysts, information system specialists, business systems, like this is why all these people were removed from the STEM draw. And cybersecurity specialists, moderate risk of shortage. And it was last updated on February 13th, 2025. And all these things got trimmed from STEM February 27th, 2025, when that press release came out where they said, we're adding the education category. But they also didn't mention that they removed most of the real STEM occupations anyways. Next February, that's when I believe they're going to change the categories, because they are basing it off of the COPs. That's where you find these outliers, right? Like they throw cooks in the construction trade straws because there is a moderate risk of shortage we saw for cooks. How does that influence your decision-making process? Well, if you're an applicant and you're like, you know what, I'm just going to get a job as a pharmacy assistant. Look at pharmacy assistant. It's only a moderate risk of shortage. Yes, insurance agents still made the cut with a moderate risk of shortage, but if the new data comes out that this is now in a balanced labor market, or the projections are that it's balanced, it might likely be removed. This one is currently, it says it's in a balance, but other assisting occupations in support of health services, it is in the healthcare draws, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, which you can see what the occupations are this way. Find something that is in a strong risk of shortage. So when somebody's asking me, Steve, should I go in and get a healthcare job? I said, well, maybe. I think PSWs, nurse aides, orderlies, strong risk of shortage. There will be, I think, for some time. It's a very tough job, though. And in some provinces, it can be regulated differently. There's also a strong risk of shortage. So that's likely going to remain in there. Things like early childhood educators and assistants, social and community service workers, but maybe not an instructor of persons with disabilities. It's only moderate risk. If you're trying to choose a new NOC, I do think that these are going to persist. I don't think anyone anticipated that they were going to gut STEM the way they did, but I know why they did, because of the glut of tech workers. But I don't necessarily think that's a good way to run a long-term immigration strategy. Data scientist has a lot more transferable skills and likely more savings and likely more network connections than someone who's in a tier 3, like a insurance agent or broker or a line cook. So when it comes to who we're choosing for our long-term PR, I don't necessarily agree fully with the category-based selection, and there are issues with it. But this is what it's kind of shaping up to be. If this budget passes, you can expect that 30% of TAs are going to be going to French people because they've got to hit that 31,000 person target, and that's the only thing that they can select based upon. Okay, they can't change the sponsorship requirements. If you want to get into a category specific draw, right now, it's actually not too challenging. You just need 6 months of full-time experience in that occupation. That is 6 months equivalent of full-time experience. There are some things to consider, but I don't see why you couldn't, for someone, let's say you did start working 20 hours a week as a pharmacy assistant. Basically, you're almost at 30, but you're not quite at 30. You're 66% of 30. So you're going to be basically require 33% more time plus 6 months. So something like 8.5, 9 months. I know it sounds confusing, but let's say you are working full time and you're working 35, 37 hours a week and you're working as a software engineer. Maybe you pick up a part time job. I know it sucks on the weekend at a pharmacy and do two 12-hour days. Now you've got 24 hours a week that you can count towards your pharmacy meeting the requirement for the pharmacy. You can't count more than 30 hours a week for Canadian experience. But if you've already met the 1 year or 2 years of Canadian experience or whatever you're at, and you've got a year left on your PGWP, that is, I believe, that's a viable option. And that it really is the only way that you can immigrate to Canada now without foreign skilled work experience, either in a category based draw. So either any one of these categories, and I don't think they are going to bring back STEM, or if they do, it's going to be based on the shortage of these, right? So I don't see them bringing back data scientists and things like that. For any of these too, like even agriculture, agri-food, there's one occupation in there. I think they're going to do a lot of education, healthcare, and they're going to somehow remove cook from trades. I think they're like, we have to do this because they're sales and service, and I would hope that they also remove insurance agents from STEM. This is pretty much the only way you can, in my view, qualify for PR through Express Entry if you do not have federal skilled work experience. You either need to learn CLB7 French or get 6 months experience, of qualifying experience, I should say, in an occupation in demand, and hope to God they don't change it, they don't rug pull you, and wait around for February until that I believe is going to come out end of February, because that appears to be when the COPS data is going to come out. That's if you don't have federal skilled work experience. Now, if you do want to get into the good old school CEC, you need to be what I would consider an express entry unicorn, which is now basically the remaining 1/3 of invitations. Back in the day, you might have had 85, 90,000 people go through CEC. Now I think it's, even though the category based ones and some of the French can still be considered CEC, I'm talking about like general CEC draws, not occupation specific, not French category language specific. You've got to be over 530 at least to guarantee, I'd say. And if you're lucky, maybe 520. And if they do a draw down to 520 again, I think the lowest one last year was 521. And it is just physically impossible, right? Without foreign skilled work experience, because, which is sad for people that went to really good schools like Waterloo, and now they're working in a high paid tech occupation. And it doesn't matter if they work for 3 years. If there's no category draw and they don't learn French, they're done. A little small 4,000 through the Atlantic Immigration Program, Provincial Nominee Program. This is the big difference, okay? So last year it was 55,000, and Ontario didn't run any human capital priorities draws this year. BC basically paused their PNP. They only invited doctors that made over $180 an hour or something. Because the provincial nomination programs were rug pulled by the federal government, they really had to drastically cut back on their nominations and their programs. And that's why their queues went through the roof. Now they are bringing it back to a more reasonable level. I like provincial nominee programs because I like provincial officers, and I believe that provinces do know their economy much better than the federal government. It's a little bit of a longer process, and it sometimes can involve a little bit more costs, but this will mean that you should be ready for any potential provincial nomination programs. That generally falls under two different categories. One is an express entry version. Some require or suggest an expression of interest, like Alberta. Some are like Ontario, that just require that you have the equivalent of a bachelor's degree, 1 year of experience, meet one of the requirements, either CEC or FSW. And then if you have enough ties to Ontario that can be demonstrated in your profile, like if they see that you studied in Ontario, at an Ontario institution, and now that you have a job in Ontario, and they see the knock that it's in. So it's very important that your knock is correct. they will go through and they might do a priority occupations draw, which I think they're going to increasingly kind of rely on that. I personally really like the human capital priorities draws and Ontario Express Entry, BC Express Entry, and Alberta Express Entry. They're my favorite. They don't require a job offer and they process fast like Express Entry and they're eligible for bridging open work permits. So those are just some things that I would keep in mind. But perhaps one of the frustrating thing too is that they're just increasing the number so much for the protected persons while just so marginally increasing the economic class. And if anything, right now, we should be encouraging those who are being selected because of their ability to contribute to Canada, not because of their need to avoid persecution. Right now, I just don't think that we have the capacity and the ability to even look after our own people, our own temporary residents, our own permanent residents, our own Canadian citizens to be even thinking about a 400% increase in protected persons. But I think most Canadians do feel the way I do, that we value having a very robust and strong and merit based economic class migration system because, as I was mentioning, in the budget, they didn't show the number. They do mention they'll do a one time for protected persons, but they don't put how many people. They don't put 115,000 because that is a lot. They put in 33,000 work permit holders, and they mention these are people who have established strong roots in their community and built a strong economy because they know that's the will of the Canadian people. And we know that it is because when you look at immigration levels plan, the consultations, 91% of stakeholders and individuals from over 4,000 different organizations believe that addressing economic and labor force needs are the number one priority. The lowest priority is actually supporting Francophone immigration, which we know that there's a reason that 30% of our express entry ITAs are going to Francophones. It is because of the change in the Official Languages Act, where now look at this, economic classes, they want them to be prioritized more than anything, more than the protected persons class. That's huge. It's a big difference. This shows you that this is exactly why I think they left it out of the budget. And I think why they left it out of the targets too, because it is a very, very high target. They do mention here they want communities, right? Like we believe if they want 25,000 Francophone migrants, they should be putting them in the small French communities so that the French communities can be preserved. It makes no sense to just dump them off in Vancouver and they don't speak even English and maybe can't find a job. That's not good. So I find this is fun to look through this whole thing, but this is what you do notice is that we Canadians are overwhelmingly in favor of economic class immigration, and unfortunately, this is another thing in 2023 and 2024. We can see, like I mentioned, one of the issues with category-based selection is that it applies to both Canadian experienced class and federal skilled worker. What is kind of disturbing here is seeing that so many of the proportion in Canada. So it's nice to see that in 2024, okay, that more healthcare people were in Canada. It's great to see a high amount of trades. They actually used to do real trades draws back in the day before they added cooks. We haven't seen one in 2025, which is kind of scary. I do like to see three quarters coming from within Canada. I think that's important, right? People who have lived, studied, and work in Canada are much better integrated. I mean, they're working. They've made it. They are now what the IRPA and the IRPA consider an economic class migrant, somebody who can become economically established in Canada. What I find so, I guess, disturbing is the 17 and 19% from the French draws. And because there's a good amount of spots, 32.5% proportion of express entry invitations issued. So I'm not kidding when I say 9% or 8.5% of the target is a little bit of a misrepresentation. It's actually like 1/3 of ITAs are going to people who are, for the most part, overseas, 81% overseas. And to put that in perspective for Canadians, what that means is you hear about people who have been here 7, 8, 9 years that are currently working, that are earning an income, they have a family, maybe they have a home, and they don't have a way to stay. But we are then going abroad and essentially inviting people to land in this country as PRs without necessarily having a job offer, without maybe even having ever been to Canada. If I were to show you, and this is also very misrepresentative as well, when they say the average CRS score was 450, you need to consider, okay, that when you get an invitation, or sorry, when you speak CLB7 French, you get an additional 50 points for French proficiency. So you automatically get 50 points for being in the category anyways. So this really is more like 400 is the average score. And 400 is pretty low when the average score for Canadian experience class, I mean, at least this year has been like 530, right? This year proposed include a continued focus on addressing long-term and supporting economic growth through Francophone immigration. You've got to learn French. It really is number one for them. And addressing long-term labor shortages. We're also interested to hear from sectors. You heard from sectors, and sectors told you what we wanted, and they're really not listening. The majority of ITAs are going French category draws, which Canadians didn't say was a big issue. This is another report that can it really breaks down. This is where you see how many were federal skilled workers. I think it's still sad that we're inviting federal skilled workers at a time when we've got about 3 million people surplus temporary residents in Canada right now. Like, we have 2.5 million temporary residents that the vast majority of them are actually working, and they're going to be having to leave because their status is expiring. But why would we even think about inviting new ones when we could potentially train these existing ones who are going home to learning French instead? I think that would be a better, they're already integrated into the economy. So that's pretty much just my 2 cents on the immigration levels plan. It's frustrating. There's the good, the bad, the ugly. The kind of like the way that MP did it, Nate. I think the good, overall, the good in this is reducing the influx of temporary residents. That was very important. So putting that hard cap of, like, this is like 155,000 students. That's already half the cap of what it was last year, and they didn't even reach the cap last year. So that's good. That is 13% of the US. Like, I think the US has like 1 million foreign students. So we're proportionally still a little bit more than the United States. I think that's a decent metric. Workers, 230,000. When they break it down further, it's actually pretty crazy because I think it's only 60,000 in the temporary foreign worker program, which means we're going to see further cuts to LMIAs, which I think is great, like low wage LMIAs, and only reserved for possibly high skilled, high wage occupations. 60,000 the temporary foreign worker program. In 2024, I think they had issued something like 220,000 LMIAs. So the good is that we're going to see stability, and this is important because this is now more of a, if you're getting 385 influx a year and 385 transitioning a year roughly to PR, that's pretty good, right? Input minus output. That's what you want. I think these are only going to remain low like this for a short period of time. That is, those are quite low. Like, I think for workers, it may go up a little bit more. But yeah, a 1-to-1, 1-to-2 ratio, I think is great. I think it's great. For every temporary resident that comes to Canada as a worker or a student, half can stay, right? Something like that. For every 2 workers and for every 2 students, for every 2 workers, one can stay. I think that's kind of a good target. During Trudeau's era, it became more like 10 could come and one could stay. We are still dealing with the effects of that, and I am a little bit concerned because these are just new admissions and for permits that are outside the country. If you look at the disclaimer, I don't know. Maybe they will keep up with 250,000 LMIAs and we'll just have these 2.5 million temporary residents that just never end up leaving and still all fighting to try and immigrate and compete. That may be a reality too. So I don't know how they're going to refuse applications so much from within the country. I think they will, even if they do issue 220,000 LMIs without changing the program, they would just have to refuse out of country work permits more. And that we are likely going to see that. We already have seen it as consultants. If you're wondering where to look, what to do, you've got to make a decision. Do you learn French? Do you try and qualify for a category based draw? Which category? Which one's easiest for you to pivot into? Where can you find work? If it comes to extending your offer or extending your stay in Canada, like I said, I believe that it only really makes sense to stay if you are in a good job and you're enjoying what you're doing.